News of the Times, Crime Compilation, Deadly Love. Welcome to News of the Times. In today's end of month Crime Compilation episode, we look at 6 cases where love turns deadly. Case 1, 1840, the case of the obsession turning to murder. A favourite story of ours recounting how one woman's obsession with her neighbour leads to murder of a most unexpected kind. Case 2, 1871, the case of the Eltham murder. This infamous case highlighted in detail the perils of the help becoming entangled with members of those they served. The outcome of this hideous crime would lead to a full-scale, violent public demonstration and the requirement of the family to move. Case 3, 1871, case of the murder of Frederic Moon. This case was quite interesting in that the Moon family had both power and considerable influence. It would seem that young Frederic Moon had been carrying on a long-term affair with an aging woman with alcohol issues. Had he begun to tire of her? Case 4, 1871, the case of the Stockwell tragedy. Reverend Selby, by all accounts, was a quiet, unassuming gentleman who quietly went about his business. His wife was quite the opposite, generating much sympathy with Reverend Selby's friends, and then one day it would seem he just couldn't take it any more. Case 5, 1874, the case of the St. Mellons tragedy. A spinster 20 years older than the dashing young man who unexpectedly pays attention to her, and it all goes horribly wrong rather quickly. And case 6, 1887, the case of the murder of Miriam Angel. This infamous case came into with renowned notoriety with the alleged calling out of the name Lipsky in the investigation into Jack the Ripper. This is the story behind the name. And we end this episode with a further particulars story recounting an 1888 famous act which pretend murders take place and are investigated for the paying audience. We hope you enjoy the show. Case 1. Mary Ann Britland was a 38-year-old unhappily married factory worker and barmaid living in Ashton-under-Lyme with her husband Thomas, 44, her daughter Hannah, 19, and a younger daughter, Susanna. Their neighbours were Mary and Thomas Dixon, who lived across the street. Mary Ann was in love with Thomas Dixon, although investigations completely exonerated him from in any way having encouraged Mary Ann. Differing accounts state that she was having an affair with Thomas Dixon, but this remains unproven. It could be that this was a love fantasy strictly in Mary Ann's head. From the Derby Daily Telegraph, May 1886. Mysterious deaths. Considerable sensation has been aroused in Ashton-under-Lyme by the arrest of Mrs. Mary Ann Britland on a charge of causing the death of a woman named Mary Dixon, who died suddenly a fortnight ago. Death was described to abdominal spasms, but the police had some suspicion and requested the coroner to interfere. An inquest was held and an analysis ordered of the internal organs. It is believed that the arrest had been made in consequence of the analyst's report. The interest in this case is heightened by the fact that Britland's daughter and husband have both died suddenly within the past 2 months, and it is likely that the bodies will be exhumed for examination. Mrs. Britland is known to have purchased vermin killer in Ashton, and a belief prevails in some quarters that there is a close association between these purchases of poison and the 3 deaths. In February 1886, Mary Ann made 2 trips to the chemist for the purchase of Harrison's vermin killer. Mary Ann claimed it was for mice infestation in her house. The vermin killer mixture included both arsenic and strychnine as its lethal components. Mary Ann was heard to have had indiscreet conversations about mouse powder and poisoning, including questioning to others whether such poison could be traced after death. Mary Ann's first victim was her 19-year-old daughter Hannah in March 1886. Hannah's death was attributed to natural causes. In actuality, she had been poisoned with the aforementioned vermin killer. Mary Ann happily pocketed the £10 insurance payout owed. In her later confession, Mary Ann stated that she had suspected that her daughter Hannah had realized her infatuation with their neighbor Thomas Dixon. Hannah had to go. It is possible that Hannah was killed in advance of the planned murder of her father to ensure that she could not testify against her mother in the event of questions surrounding the planned death of Thomas, her husband. On May the 3rd, her husband Thomas, aged 44, was murdered using the same vermin powder as before. His death was attributed to epilepsy. This also involved another life insurance payout. The kindly neighbours, Mary and Thomas Dixon, took in the grieving Mary Ann Britland as she recovered from the quick and unexpected deaths of her daughter and husband. On the 14th of May, Mary Dixon, the wife of Mary Ann's beloved Thomas Dixon, died, leaving the path clear for Thomas to fall in love with Mary Ann. However, this rapid succession of deaths in such close proximity alerted the police, and investigations ensued. All 3 deaths were very similar in nature and in close time proximity, which aroused suspicion. From Lloyd's Weekly Newsletter, May the 30th, 1886. At Ashton-under-Lyne on Tuesday, Mary Ann Britland was apprehended on suspicion of having caused the death of a young married woman named Mary Dixon by poisoning her with vermin killer. The prisoner's husband died about 3 weeks ago after a brief illness, and she then went to live with Mrs. Dixon, who had just died after only 7 hours' illness. It is alleged that the prisoner purchased the poison at a chemist's shop. She was brought before the magistrates on Wednesday, when the chief constable stated that she was suspected of having caused the death of 2 other persons, her husband and her daughter, both of whom died suddenly recently. Evidence was given that the prisoner had made 2 purchases of vermin killer, which contained strychnine, and the chief constable said that on a future occasion he should produce evidence that strychnine was found in the stomach of Mary Dixon by the analyst. The only additional evidence was that the prisoner was staying at the house of Mr. and Mrs. Dixon from the 3rd to the 13th inst, when the latter died. The prisoner was remanded. Application is to be made to the Home Secretary for authority to exhume the bodies of the 2 other persons. The authority to exhume the bodies of her daughter Hannah and her husband Thomas was given. Lethal doses of strychnine were found in all 3 bodies, and Mary Ann was to jail. At trial, Mary Ann's defence was that she could not have done it as there was an absence of motive. She continued that the small insurance payouts were not worth the deaths of her daughter and her husband. The prosecution's case was that Mary Ann's primary motive was an obsessive infatuation with Thomas Dixon, requiring her to murder all those in her path to obtain Thomas Dixon. The evidence against her was too damning to ignore. She had purchased vermin killer containing strychnine in enough quantities to kill all 3 victims. Strychnine had been found in all 3 victims. All 3 had died in a similar way. Most damning of all, there was no mice infestation in her house. Additionally, there had been the conversations she had had with others asking about the traceability of mouse poison. From The Guardian, July the 28th, 1886. A factory operative, Mary Ann Britland, was found guilty at the Manchester Assizes on Monday of the murder of 3 persons, her husband, daughter and neighbour, by poisoning at Ashton-under-Lyne. It was shown that she had purchased the poison, had obtained the insurance money on the death of each of her victims, and had taken up her abode with the husband of her neighbour. From the Echo, August the 9th, 1886. Execution of a woman. The woman, Mary Ann Britland, was executed this morning in Strangeways Jail for the murder of a woman named Dixon at Ashton-under-Lyne in May last. She was also charged with the murder of her husband in the same way by poisoning him with vermin killer. She is reported to have made a full confession of her guilt of the first crime, and when asked by some relatives who visited her on Saturday whether she had done away with her husband and daughter, she hung down her head and did not deny it. During last night, the convict, who had listened to the ministrations of the prison chaplain with gratitude, was greatly excited, and at midnight she was heard singing snatches of hymns. This morning, when offered refreshment, she was unable to take it. She went to the scaffold supported by 2 female warders, and the executioner, Berry of Bradford, lost no time in fixing the rope and arranging the other preliminaries. The scene as the procession moved to the scaffold was very painful. The voice of the chaplain, as he read the usual prayers, was drowned by the screams of the woman. "O Lord, have mercy! O Lord, forgive me!" she piteously cried out. But when once on the scaffold, the necessary details were at once completed, and when the drop fell, the woman appeared to die instantly. A drop of 7 feet was allowed. Mary Ann Britland became the first woman to be executed at Manchester's Strangeway prison. Case 2. In this tale it is 1871, and pretty maid Jane Maria Clausen is found battered to such an extent that the bone above her eye is described as utterly fragmented and her brains protruding out. The forlorn, dark road where she is found is a perfect spot for murder, but Jane has excitedly told many of whom she was to meet. The son of her last employer, who she has been romantically involved with for the last several months. Indeed, pregnant Jane was dismissed from her position due to her condition. Jane, although utterly battered, is able to indicate her attacker before she expires. On April the 26th, 1871, Jane Maria Clausen, 26, an attractive domestic servant, was found prostrate on a quiet little-known lane in Eltham. Her head and face had been bludgeoned to the point of her brains protruding. Jane managed to survive a few more days before dying. She spoke a few words at the scene, referring police to Mary Smith as knowing all. From the Illustrated Police News on the 6th of May, 1871. The mysterious outrage in Eltham. The strange outrage upon the young woman at Eltham has created a profound sensation in the district. On Thursday, the police were making every effort to discover the perpetrators, but as are yet without any definite information. The following particulars, in addition to those already given, are reported. About 1 o'clock on Wednesday morning, a labourer living near Kidbrooke Lane heard a female cry out twice, "Don't murder me, Ned! Don't murder me, Ned!" Strange to say, he took no action upon hearing the cries. At 4 o'clock the same morning, Police Constable Gum, 225R, was walking along Kidbrooke Lane when he saw a young woman lying upon her back in the road. There was a pool of blood near her, and the road and pathway leading from the hedge was streaked with blood. The woman was partly insensible, and her head was chopped in 5 places. The brain was protruding from one of the wounds in the skull. The officer instantly sprang his rattle, and assistance was soon at hand, and the poor woman was removed to Guy's Hospital. The poor creature, whose face was one mass of contusions and cuts, evidently inflicted with a stick and a chopper, made use of the following remarks after she was discovered by the policeman. "Take hold of my hand. Lord, help me. I have been murdered. Mary Smith knows about it." Her eyes were closed, and her face wore an expression of agony. She was very restless, and she often closed her lips firmly and threw her hands up as if she was struggling with some persons. The surgeons from the first said her death could not be prevented, but she might live 2 or 3 days. The following official description of the sufferer was forwarded to every police station in the metropolis, in the hope that the friends of the unhappy woman might see it and come forward and identify her. A young woman, aged about 25 years, found in the roadway at Kidbrooke Lane, hair brown, 5'3" in height, dressed in a chocolate-ribbed barge dress, black cloth jacket trimmed with black silk braid, crochet work around the neck, black lace bonnet with 3 red roses in it, 11 shillings and 6pence in money in a blue leather purse, and a brass clasp and chain. Near the spot where the poor woman was discovered there is a pond, and the police have traced bloody footsteps to the edge of it. Upon the water of the pond there were spots of blood floating, and it is believed that the miscreants washed their hands in the pond after they had left their victim lying on the pathway. It is evident that the poor creature crawled off the pathway into the centre of the road, where she was found by the constable. Given the distressing injuries to her face, it took some time for her to be identified. Reports circulated in all of the papers with a detailed description of her height, hair colour, and clothing. Finally, an uncle of the girl came forward and confirmed the identity of the now dead victim as that of Jane Marie Clouston. Background. Jane was pregnant and had been involved with the son of her employer, a respectable stationer and bookseller, Mr. Pooke. The son, Walter Edmund, referred by Jane and others as Ned, had been having an affair together for some time. Jane had been dismissed from service a fortnight previously, but it would seem that Jane and Edmund had continued with their relationship. Walter Edmund, Ned, was the youngest son of Mr. Pook. His elder brother had already received harsh recriminations for having married a woman beneath his station. Edmund knew that a marriage with Jane would have been an impossibility. The impact socially of having to marry from the domestic class would have ensured that the family would have been excluded from polite society. The crime. On the day of the horrific attack sustained by Jane, Jane was bubbling with joy that she would be meeting with Ned, who had sent her a letter requesting a meeting. In her enthusiasm with her friends, she shared how Ned had come up with an alternative to her having to learn the machine. We assume this referred to factory work, and he was going to tell her of all his news upon their meeting that evening. This was the last her friends would see of her alive. From the Illustrated Police News, the 6th of May, 1871, the mysterious outrage in Eltham. The victim of this diabolical outrage died early on Monday morning. The unfortunate girl has at length been identified. At about 1 o'clock on Monday morning, a person named William Trott, residing at Old King Street, Deptford, went to Superintendent Griffin at the police station in Greenwich and informed him that he and his family had read late on Sunday night the account in the papers of the Eltham outrage, and from the description given of the girl and her clothing, he believed it to be his niece, and so impressed were they with the circumstances that they felt that they could not go to bed till they ascertained the truth about the matter. The description given was so minute and exact as to justify the superintendent in taking immediate action in the matter. On ascertaining that the girl, whose name was given as Jane Maria Clewson, had been in service for 2 years at a stationer and bookseller's, Mr. Pook's, in the town, inquiry was made, when it transpired that she had had notice and had left on the Thursday fortnight previous. The poor girl's father, who is a night watchman at Limehouse, was then sent for, and he gave it as his opinion that the body was that of his daughter. Superintendent Griffin, Inspector Mulvaney, and Inspector Sayer, with their detectives under themselves, immediately acted on other information they had obtained, and also proceeded to make further inquiries. It transpired that the unfortunate deceased Jane Coulson had been led to believe herself to be engaged to one of her master's sons. During the time, however, that she was lodging in the widow's room where she boarded herself, she was noticed to be very frequently sorrowful, quite dejected, and her eyes often appeared as if she had been crying. When asked a few days ago by a young friend what made her so sorrowful, it is stated that she in confidence told her companion that she was afraid that she was pregnant. On Tuesday night, the last time she was seen alive, when she was going out at about 7 o'clock, she appeared in very good spirits and said she was going to meet Ned. After she had left the house, she was met on the road by a lady who knew her and asked her where she was going. She replied, "Oh, I'm going to meet Edmund tonight. He has sent for me, and I am to meet him at Crooms Hill. He says he has such a deal to tell me tonight, and he's not going to let me learn the machine. He's going to do something better than that for me." She was then seen by others to go in the direction of Crooms Hill, which is on the road to the narrow, grassy, and frequented lane in which she was found so fearfully injured. There is not a house near, and the helpless victim, once allured there, might for a long time cry for help in vain. The general opinion is that the hatchet was brought for the purpose. the spot selected, and the deluded victim enticed there for deliberate murder. From the spot where she received her death wounds to a brook about 100 yards off there was a rather small footmarks, and by the side of the brook it was evident someone had washed blood from their hands. As police continued investigations, one name continued to arise: 20-year-old James Edmund Pook. From the Illustrated Police News on the 6th of May 1871, the mysterious outrage in Eltham, the capture of the supposed murderer. The police arrested at 3 o'clock on Monday afternoon Mr. James Edmund Pook, the son of a printer living in Greenwich, on suspicion of causing the death of the deceased young woman. When arrested, he made no statement. At 9:30 o'clock on Monday night, William Clark of Deptford communicated the following statement to the police, and he said, "I know the deceased girl. She was a friend of mine. 6 weeks ago I accompanied her to her employer, Mr. Pook's, the printer, in Greenwich. It was on a week-night evening. She and I spoke to Mary Smith, a young girl of 18, who knew her. Mary Smith is a domestic servant living in Greenwich. Mr. Edmund Pook, the son of her employer, was present, and he was on very friendly terms with Mary Smith. They all appeared to know each very well. I left deceased at Mr. Pook's house, and I was not her young man. I was only a friend of hers. The reason that induces me to come forward is that I think by telling all I know I may do some good. Edmund Pook. Young Edmund Pook was the second son in his family. As the eldest had already disgraced the family by marrying a woman beneath the family's perceived social class, pressure was on young Edmund not to follow in his brother's footsteps. Yet it would seem that young Edmund was a bit of a tearaway, and his dalliance with Jane was not his first one. From the Leeds Mercury, the 20th of May, 1871. The Eltham murder. The young man Pook was again before the Greenwich police magistrate yesterday afternoon. The court and its approaches were densely crowded. The first witness was Alice Durnford, who stated that she had kept company with the prisoner for about 12 months, but he did not visit at her father's house. He used to whistle to her as a signal. She described the way in which he was generally dressed and stated that a metal whistle picked up by the police a few yards from the spot where the murdered girl was found was like the one used by the prisoner. Pook's father, Ebenezer Witcher Pook, throughout the trial was a strong presence within the defence. The murder at Eltham. The examination. On Saturday last, Edmund Walter Pook, the young man in custody on suspicion of being concerned with the murder of Jane Maria Clewson in the neighbourhood of Eltham, was again brought before Mr. Maud at the Greenwich Police Court. A good deal of interest was evinced at the proceedings. The prisoner is an intelligent-looking young man. He looks older than his 20 years of age, with which he is credited in his charge sheet. He is of sallow complexion, has black hair divided in the centre, is the possessor of a remarkably sharp pair of black eyes, and has no moustache or beard. He was dressed in black, and throughout the examination he seemed to thoroughly realise the position in which he is placed. His father occupied a seat almost in front of his son. The father, Ebenezer Pook, had worked as the printer at the Times and was clearly well connected socially. Almost immediately the family of battered murdered Jane Coulson was forced to defend Jane from accusations of her being a prostitute. From the Illustrated Police News on the 6th of May, 1871, the mysterious outrage in Eltham. On Monday night, William Richard Trott, the uncle of the deceased, made the following statement, with which we give now his exact words. I am the uncle of the deceased girl, and I live at 6 Agnes Place in Deptford. Her name was Jane Clewson. She was 17 years of age. I am a lighterman. She was the daughter of a watchman living at Millwall. She is my wife's sister's child. Her mother has been dead 4 years. She has a sister aged 12 living, and some years ago her eldest died in her 13th year of consumption. It is false to state that she or any of her sisters were ever prostitutes or were ever in a house of ill fame. I wish the published statement to that effect to be contradicted, and if the newspapers will be kind enough to do so, in order that the character of our family may not be damaged. She never had an elder sister a prostitute, and I am sorry that the person who wrote in some of the papers were misled. On last Tuesday night, she said to Miss Hamilton at 12 Ashburnham Road, Greenwich, lodgings where she has last lived at, I'm going to see my young man tonight at the top of Maze Hill at 7 o'clock. Her young man was named Pook. He was the son of her late employer. She had then left her situation 14 days. She was never seen alive after that time. She was a religious and virtuous girl. She was educated at the Wesleyan Baptist School, and she had a companion named Mary Smith, and she associated with her. Mary Smith left her place suddenly on Wednesday, and she has not since been heard of. I recognised the body of my niece on Monday at Guy's Hospital at 9:30 o'clock. The first that I knew of her death was reading a description of her and her clothes in the newspapers on Sunday night. I have found several letters from a young man in her box. I have given them to the police, who have asked me not to tell who they are signed by. She has often taken tea with me. She was a good, handsome girl. The excitement has increased in the neighbourhood. The attack. The attack sustained by Jane was horrific, with sustained hammering and stabbing of her face. The attacks took place face to face. There were no contusions to the back of her head, so she would have been looking directly at the person who had attacked her so viciously. Given the utter severity of the bashing of her face and skull, blood splatter would have been inevitable. From the Illustrated Police News, the 13th of May, 1871, the murder at Eltham. Regarding the victim of the diabolical outrage on Sunday week last, the only surprise is that she should have survived so long after her fearful injuries she received the preceding Wednesday. Mr. Harris, surgeon of Guy's Hospital, deposed at the inquest that the deceased suffered from wounds on the face, ears, arms and hands. There were altogether about a dozen incised wounds on the face, some more severe than others. 2 of the wounds were on the side of the ear, one onto the right side above the eye, where the bone was all smashed up and the brain protruded. There was no injury on the back of the head. His opinion was that the injuries were occasioned by a sharp and heavy instrument, such as the hammer found at the scene and a chopper. The solitary path known as Kidbrooke Lane, where the poor creature received her death wounds, is a place that few persons would care to walk along in the dead hours of the night. The case was of an enormous interest at the time. A respectable family, the attractive young maid seduced by the younger brother. Jane was pregnant and had been dismissed, one supposed, due to her family condition, although the family counted that she had been dismissed due to her sloppy work. Crowds attended every court appearance attempting to crowd in, and the story was headline news nationally. Investigations. The police followed every lead that they had, although there were no witnesses to the actual crime itself. Edmund Pook, upon being arrested, was asked to hand over all of his clothes. His clothes were handed to the local doctor for study. Blood splatter was found on Edmund's clothing. Splatter drops on his trouser leg, his shirt and hat. Tests at the time could confirm that the blood was indeed human blood, but could not confirm whose blood. Hair colour and type that matched the now deceased Jane was also found on the clothes of Pook and on the hammer that had been used. From the Illustrated Police News, 20th of May 1871, the murder at Eltham. The examination. The police have been actively engaged in this matter, and the clothes have been sent to Dr. Leatherby. On the trousers sent to him there were a number of spots of blood found on the left leg. In striking that young woman, whoever that person may have been that struck her, his left leg would be more forward than his right leg, and thus more likely to get the blood upon it. There is to this fact also that on the left leg there was human hair upon it, and although it must be admitted that this young woman's hair is a common colour, yet that found on the left leg of the prisoner's trousers exactly corresponds with that belonging to the young woman. Spots of blood were also found on the prisoner's shirt sleeves, and there was also spots of blood on the outside rim of the hat that he was wearing. There were also marks of blood on the hammer. More evidence was gathered. The store in which the hammer was bought was found, and the owner of the shop confirmed that the purchaser was Edmund Pook. A friend had bumped into Pook not far away from where the murder was committed on the day, and within an hour of the murder. And from the Leeds Mercury, the 20th of May 1871, the Eltham murder. A furnishing ironmonger named Sparshot, living in High Street, Deptford, said that on the evening of April the 24th, the night before the murder, a man who he believed to be the prisoner came to his shop and wished to purchase a small axe or chopper. He, the witness, could not furnish him with the exact article he wanted, and directed him to the shop of Mr. Thomas, a few yards lower down the street. The witness was cross-examined at some length by the prisoner's solicitor, but adhered to his statement. Two other witnesses deposed to meeting the prisoner coming down Royal Hill, Greenwich, about 10 minutes to 9 on the night of the murder, and he was walking fast, but not running. All in all, the prosecuting side managed to find 7 witnesses who could all confirm having seen Pook and Jane together on the night of her murder. The initial coroner's inquest found there to be reasonable evidence that Pook was likely guilty of the murder of Jane Clewson. The full trial was to take place at the Old Bailey in July 1871, some 3 months after Jane's murder on the 26th of April. The defence was highly proactive. For every witness the prosecution could produce, the defence were able to find a counter-witness to create doubt in the minds of the jury. There were many questions regarding how the trial was run. For example, the judge, Sir William Boville, disallowed the mention of any of the statements made by Jane Clewson after her attack, which included any of her references to Edmund Ned Pook. The case was watched intensely by the public. The majority of the papers believed they had a guilty verdict on their hands, and had the papers' editions stating the same prepared, but no. From the Buckingham Advertiser and Free Press, the 22nd of July, 1871, the Eltham murder. The trial of Edmund Walter Pook for the murder of Jane Maria Clewson was resumed on Friday morning before Lord Chief Justice Boville, continued again on Saturday. Thomas Lascelles, a gardener, was the first witness called on Friday. He stated that on the evening of the 25th of April at about 10 minutes to 7 o'clock, he met the prisoner Pook in the barnfield in Kidbrooke Lane. He, the prisoner Pook, was in company with a young woman at the time. During Lascelles' cross-examination, it was elicited that on the morning of April the 26th, a blood-stained handkerchief or duster had been found near the scene of the crime, but the police, not thinking it of much importance, had said nothing about it. This course of conduct was severely censured by the judge. His lordship also commented upon the absence of the policeman who should have been on duty in the neighbourhood of Kidbrooke Lane at the time of the commission of the murder, according to the theory of the prosecution. Mr. Huddleston then summoned up the evidence for the defence, and the Solicitor General replied on the whole case for the prosecution, after which the Lord Chief Justice summed up the case to the jury. His lordship concluded his summing up at 20 minutes to 9, more than 6 hours having been occupied in reading and commenting upon the evidence. The jury then retired to consider their verdict and were absent from court for 20 minutes. On their return, they gave a verdict of not guilty, followed by loud applause, which could not be suppressed by the officers of the court. The Chief Justice thanked the jury for the great attention that they had paid throughout the trial, which had occupied the court for 4 days. The news of the not guilty verdict to the crowds waiting outside was not met with happiness. There was a sense that Pook had gotten away with it by using his family financials and position in society. From the Buckingham Advertiser and Free Press, the 22nd of July, 1871, the Eltham murder. The verdict in the Eltham murder was expected with the utmost anxiety at Greenwich. Large crowds had collected in the streets, who were rather noisily and demonstrative. At 10 o'clock the verdict was known. Shortly after, a procession of men and boys was formed and went through the streets carrying flags. Among those flags, some were wholly black and others bore the word blood. Every train that came from London was watched with the keenest anxiety, in the hopes of seeing young Pook. A number of persons also collected outside the house of Mr. Pook, the father of the accused, and there gave expression to their feelings by yelling loudly. On Monday night, the town of Greenwich was for several hours the scene of very disgraceful conduct on the part of a mob of 3,000 or 4,000 persons, who had assembled in front of the residences of Mr. Pook in London Street, and from the scenes of Saturday evening and the feeling manifested during the day, it was thought advisable to communicate with Colonel Henderson and ask for additional force of police. To this, Captain Labalde-Miniere replied that extra men would be sent down, and some 25 officers were consequently got together and held in reserve, but up to a late hour were not called into action. Notwithstanding an announcement that no processions would be allowed, about 6 o'clock a truck bearing the effigy of a figure in female attire, with a man represented in the act of committing murder with a plasterer's hammer, was paraded through the town amid great noise and disturbance. Presently a fight took place in which the effigies were torn to pieces. Throughout a great deal of violence was used, the town being in a perfect uproar and business almost entirely suspended. Great fears were entertained that the rioting would take an even more serious turn, but happily this was not the case. The more respectable portion of the inhabitants complained greatly of the inertness of the police in having allowed such large crowds of people to assemble and state their opinion. that the constables held in reserve ought to have been brought out and used for the purpose of dispersing the unruly and noisy mobs which paraded the street. Attempting to repair the damage that had been done to the family reputation, Pook Sr. came out fighting with promises to litigate against anyone who used the word murderer and his son's name. He also began an attempt to get the lead investigators of the case suspended from their jobs. After the trial, this letter from Pook Sr. appeared in the Echo. From the Buckingham Advertiser and Free Press, the 22nd of July, 1871, the Eltham murder. My name has been brought into most unenviable notoriety. My solicitor, my son Edmund Walter Pook, family, my friends, and I have been hooted and yelled at in the public streets in a most frightful and disgraceful manner, and for the last 12 weeks an agony and suspense have been endured by me and my family which rarely falls to the lot of mortals. Knowing my son to be thoroughly innocent of the foul and cruel charge which was brought against him, I appeal to you, sir, in the name of justice and then in the name of humanity, that redress may be afforded to me, and that the conduct of Griffin and Mulvaney be immediately inquired into with a view to being ignominiously dismissed from the force. If such extraordinary powers are still to be entrusted to the police, then, sir, allow me to suggest that the chief officer of a large and important division like Greenwich should be possessed of intelligence above mediocrity, and that his morality should be above suspicion. I leave my wrongs to the press, a tribunal to which an injured person may never yet be appealed in vain. I remain, sir, your obedient servant, Ebenezer Witcher Pook. July 16th, 1871. P.S. I have instructed my solicitor, Mr. H. Pook Mitre Court, Temple, to take immediate steps to indict Griffin and Mulvaney for wilful and corrupt perjury. The brave attempt to recover lost respectability were in some measure in vain. The family were forced to leave London and attempted to change their identity. The lingering stain of murderer, although acquitted, remained on Edmund Pook. As for Jane Clewson, her case officially remains a cold case. For some time afterwards, her ghost was said to haunt Kilbrook Lane, and it was the brave person who would venture there after dark. Case 3. Still in 1871, this story involves the somewhat hysterical Flora Davis. Flora, being treated for dipsomnia and with a string of names and men associated with her, is found holding the bleeding, dying body of one of her lucrative admirers. In 1871, the papers were filled with the scandalous murder of a baronet's son, Mr. Frederic Moon. The culprit, Flora Davy, was his still married mistress, with a seemingly complicated additional lover. The story went on for weeks in national headlines. That Flora was guilty was not in question. The issue of whether it was murder or manslaughter gripped the nation. An additional feature to this salacious case was that the culprit, Mrs. Flora Davy, also known as Hannah Newington, was being treated as a dipsomaniac at the time of the stabbing of Mr. Frederic Moon. Stories also abounded of Mr. Moon having begun to tire of his mistress. Family, who had always been greatly opposed to his relationship with Flora, recounted how Frederick had stated his intention of stopping his relationship with Flora. Letters to the family stating the same would be produced. The crime, 24th of May, 1871. Flora Davy, aged 38, was charged with having caused the death of Mr. Frederic Moon by stabbing him with a knife on the left side. Upon arrival at the house where the crime took place, the constable found the victim, Frederic Moon, lying on his back in a pool of blood. The assailant, Flora Davy, was in the front room. Frederic Moon is the son of Sir Francis Moon, a baronet. She was described as follows. Her clothes were in a disordered state. The upper part of her body was sodden with blood. Her hair was disarranged, and she was very much excited. Some other clothes in the room were recovered. They included a red jacket, black silk shirt, white petticoat, and a pair of cuffs, all stained with blood. The murder had happened the previous night when the surgeon was called for. He found Frederic Moon lying on the ground with Mrs. Davy on the floor beside him. Mr. Moon was clearly dying. He never spoke. The stab wound was 3 to 4 inches deep between the 5th and 6th ribs and had penetrated the heart. Mrs. Davy's initial explanation of how it had happened stated that Mr. Moon had fallen on the knife and accidentally stabbed himself. A later post-mortem showed this not to be the case. Mr. Moon soon died whilst being attended to by the local surgeon. It had been too late to help him. The following is a recounting of the conversation that took place between Dr. Phillips, Mrs. Davy's personal doctor, treating Mrs. Davy for dipsomania. Dr. Phillips stated, I saw Mrs. Davy after Mr. Moon had expired. She was much agitated and said, "Oh, doctor, how is he?" I replied, "The man is dead, Mrs. Davy." She said, "Impossible," and fell down in a sort of semi-swoon in the chair. She said again, "Oh, doctor, doctor, I am afraid it is I who did it." I said, "It is impossible. You could not have done it." She answered, "I'm afraid I did." I said, "For God's sake, explain yourself." She said, "We were sitting together after dinner at the table when Fred made an observation to me about my daughter which annoyed me excessively. I begged him not to repeat it, for I could not stand it. He then said, 'If you are not silent, I will throw the bottle at your head.' I then jumped up with a knife in my hand. We struggled and fell, and I saw the blood pouring out of his side, and I could not tell how." Mrs. Davy was remanded by the police. As investigations began, it was discovered that Flora Davy was still legally married to a solicitor now in Australia, and her real name was Hannah Newington. From the Times, May the 29th, 1871, about Flora Davy. The prisoner, who is 38 years of age, is rather tall for a woman, inclined to stoutness, but muscular and of robust appearance. Captain Davy, a retired officer of the Army and a member of the Army and Navy Club occupying the house in which the deceased was killed, having declared on oath that he was the husband of the prisoner when in fact he was not. The prisoner's real name was Newington. She was the wife of a solicitor of that name, who, however, had separated from her owing to bad conduct and had since gone to Australia. The deceased, Frederic Moon, about 12 or 14 years ago, made the acquaintance of the prisoner. Only a day or two before his death, he had given her 2 cheques for £100 each, which had been paid at the bank.
It further came out that she had been seeing a Captain Davy, whose name she had taken as her own, although they were not married. It further transpired that the two still occasionally met. Flora had known Frederic Moon for some 14 years, and it was admitted into the evidence by the prosecution that Mr. Moon had continuously lavished money and jewellery upon her the whole of the time. Frederic's family were relentless in their dislike of Flora and spent considerable sums in the prosecution trial that followed. With the family's money and influence, newspaper articles were very one-sided. She was described by the prosecution as having taken complete ownership of him. The case went to trial, where Flora's reputation came under considerable bashing. Many of her love letters to Frederic Moon were read aloud in the courtroom. The jury found Flora guilty of manslaughter within 30 minutes. Flora made her last appeal to the court. From the St. Noet's Chronicle and Advertiser, the 22nd of July, 1871, the Bayswater Tragedy, the trial of Mrs. Flora Davy, also known as Hannah Newington. At the Central Criminal Court in London on Saturday, the trial of Mrs. Flora Davy, otherwise known as Hannah Newington, for the manslaughter of Frederic Moon. The prisoner, having been called upon in the usual way to show why sentence should not be pronounced according to law, said, "Only I am innocent. If I were guilty and guilty in my own mind, no punishment would be too great for me. If I could have done that to him whom I have known for so many years. He had been all in all to me. I left my husband for him, and after remaining with him for all these years, I could not have been guilty of doing that to him. When Mr. Moon first knew me, I was mixing in the society of his own family. My husband wished to get a divorce, but to save the family of Mr. Moon, I joined my husband again at Boulogne, and the matter was condoned. My husband afterwards came to England, broke everything in the house, and left me, saying that all I wanted was a divorce, but that I should not have it. He, Frederic Moon, left me only for a little time, for he came back. In the meantime, Mr. Frederic Moon returns, and we agree that I am to be entirely with him, not to live with him altogether, but that I should belong to him. Flora continues, this last year, for 18 months after his mother's death, he was always unhappy, and he did not see enough of me. Then he proposed that I should be entirely under his protection, for he was so unhappy, as his letters state, that he could not have me all to himself. My daughter being married and settled, I determined that I would be with him entirely. That is the whole. We have been most happy. He was most kind. The whole of his consideration had been to promote my happiness, and I have studied his. I could not have done him any injury. It was in the struggle. He was going to throw a bottle, and I jumped up quickly. He tried to take the knife from me, and I'm not sure whether he got it or not. We struggled and fell, and I thought at first I must be the one injured. I said, "Oh, Fred, what have you done?" And then I found, of course, it was him, not myself. I tried all I could do something to stop it. First of all, I applied cold water. Then I remembered that cold water produced blood instead of stopping it. Then I sent for ice and tried that. Then the doctors came. I have nothing more to say, my lord. The judge's summation. Baron Channel then summed up and said, Hannah Newington, otherwise Flora Davy, you have been convicted of the offence of manslaughter by the jury who have been entrusted with the duty of trying you. Notwithstanding every desire to take in your favour, every point that could arise has been constrained and compelled the jury to find you guilty. I do not think I could quite discharge my duty as a judge were I not to say I entirely approve their verdict. You have addressed me many observations with a view of showing that the sentence should not be passed upon you, but they do not appear to me to interfere at all with the conclusions to which the jury has arrived. The sentence of 8 years penal servitude was more severe than had been anticipated. There was a sound like a sob in the court, as when many people acting under a common emotion of surprise and pity drew in their breath at once. The prisoner covered her face with her hands while Baron Channel was addressing her, and when he had finished, she fainted and had to be carried away.
Case 4. This story, also from 1871, gripped the papers. John Selby Watson, by all accounts a quiet man who only wanted a peaceful life, married an ambitious woman who was unhappy with her lot in life. By all accounts, she constantly nagged at her husband for all manner of things. Her dissatisfaction comes to a boil with the enforced retirement of John from his position at a London grammar school.
Setting the scene. John Selby Watson was the headmaster of London Grammar School who married Anne Armstrong in 1845. He had studied classics and had been ordained in 1839. He had taken a curacy in Somerset before moving to the post in London in 1844. The school was quite successful, but by 1870 the number of pupils had fallen, and the governors gave the 66-year-old Reverend Watson notice. On the 8th of October 1871, the Reverend Mr. Watson called his servant Ellen Pine to him and said that his wife had gone out of town. He added that she was to call for a doctor if she found anything wrong with him the following morning. She later found him unconscious and immediately sent for the doctor. Watson had tried to commit suicide by taking prussic acid. He had left 2 notes, one addressed to the servant containing her wages and the other addressed to the doctor. In this letter he confessed that he had killed his wife in a fit of rage, but his servant found him unwell too early, and the Reverend Mr. Watson did not die. Anne Watson's body was found upstairs in a locked bedroom. The Reverend John Selby Watson had battered her to death with the butt of his pistol, which was found on Watson's dressing table. About Mrs. Watson and the Reverend Mr. Holmes. Anne was born in Ireland. The papers reported that she was born Miss Anne Armstrong from Dublin. Her father, owing to the failure of the French bank, lost almost all his means, and ultimately his daughters were compelled to adopt the profession of governesses. During the Reverend Mr. Watson's time at Trinity College, Dublin, he met with Miss Armstrong, and after 12 years of courtship, they were married at St. Mark's Church in Dublin. From the Illustrated Police News on the 21st of October 1871. The dreadful tragedy at Stockwell. At 10:30 on Monday morning, Mr. William Carter, the coroner for East Surrey, resumed the inquest respecting the death of Mrs. Annie Watson, aged 67, who was found dead on Wednesday last, under circumstances which have caused her husband, the Reverend Mr. Selby Watson, late headmaster of the Stockwell Grammar School, to be charged with her murder. Sergeant George Hazel deposed that on Wednesday last he was called into the house at 28 St Martin's Road by Dr. Rugg. He was in the company of Sergeant Henry. Dr. Rugg and Sergeant Henry went into the bedroom on the first floor where they saw the deceased, Mrs. Ann Watson, lying in a corner. She was quite dead. Mr. Rugg then handed Sergeant Hazel 2 letters. He read one of the letters, which certainly pertained to the death of Mrs. Watson. He afterwards went into another bedroom where he saw Mr. Watson lying on a bed. Sergeant Hazel deposed, "I said to him, 'I arrest you for the murder of your wife.' He, the Reverend Watson, responded, 'I suppose so. Don't be violent.' I then said to him, 'I am not going to be violent.' He answered, 'I'm ill.' I then arrested him." Sergeant Hazel went on to add, "Yesterday at about 6 o'clock, I found in a drawer of Reverend Mr. Watson a shirt belonging to him. I produced it. The wristbands were torn off, and there were stains of blood on each sleeve." Sergeant Hazel continued, "I searched the house, and on the floor landing from the library to the bedroom, I saw some dry blood, which had evidently been caused by the blood on the clothes of the deceased being dragged along the carpet. I think the blood had been wiped. An old flint pistol was found in the library, approximately 12 inches in length. Also a new hammer wrapped up in paper that had not been used." The sergeant goes on to say that in the room he found a sponge with some whitish red hair upon it. It was stained with blood. The coroner disposed that he attributed the death of the deceased Mrs. Ann Watson to the injury of the brain produced by heavy blows which caused the wounds on the head. The blows must have been given with great force and could not possibly have been self-inflicted. The coroner went on to say, "I have examined the pistol produced and compared it with the wounds on the head, and in my opinion the wounds might have been inflicted by such an instrument. Several of the wounds exactly correspond with the butt end and trigger guard of the pistol. The stains on the pistol are evidently blood stains." The Watsons' maid, Eleanor Mary Payne, deposed, "I returned from town just about 9 o'clock, and Mr. Watson let me in to answer of my knock. When he had opened the door and was closing it upon me, he said, 'Your mistress is gone out of town and won't be home until tomorrow.' No further allusion was made by my master, Reverend Mr. Watson, that night to my mistress, Mrs. Watson. As I was going to bed, when I got as far as the library, Mr. Watson opened the door of that room. He had a candle in his hand and looked down at the floor. He said, 'That stain on the floor is port wine, which your mistress has spilt. I have told you in case you might wonder what it is.' That Reverend Mr. Watson had killed his wife was beyond question. They had a signed confession in his hand. The great question was, why had he done it? He was known as a mild and meek man, and had been a highly respected headmaster. What had driven him to the violent attack on his wife? In anticipation of a possible insanity plea, the case was investigated in depth. It became clear that there had been some measure of premeditation. This was not a crime of temporary insanity. The particular ordering of a trunk that would fit the body of his dead wife, along with some new rope with which to tie the trunk, pointed to a clear case of premeditation. From the Illustrated Police News, 21st of October, 1871. The dreadful tragedy at Stockwell. Some additional particulars in connection with the tragedy at Stockwell have been gleaned, and they tend to illustrate the domestic understanding between the accused and the victim. An ex-parish clerk who was in the service of the Reverend Mr. Watson has made the following statement. He says that for the last 20 years he had been acquainted with the Reverend Mr. Watson, who, after leaving the grammar school last Christmas, became irritable and at times despondent. The wife, who was of a nagging disposition, then became even more so. The accused Reverend Mr. Watson preached at St. Andrew's Church, Stockwell, Park Road. Whenever he ascended the pulpit, he delivered a sermon. The congregation were invariably struck with his hesitating and nervous manner, and frequently left the church while he was reading in a monotonous tone a manuscript sermon. It appears that the custom of Reverend Mr. Holmes in officiating for the Reverend Mr. Clissold seemed to have caused some unpleasantness with his wife. Mrs. Watson, upon learning the nature of a visit to the Reverend Mr. Clissold, would say in a sharp tone, "You shan't go." The Reverend Mr. Watson would agree with her wishes, then would slip out of the house unseen by her to attend the duties required of him. Upon his return, Mrs. Watson would become ill-tempered and frequently abused him. She was in the habit of reminding her husband of the mistakes he had made in his life, and after listening to her remark, he would go down from the house and walk up and down the Stockwell Park Road in a manner that excited the attention of passers-by. It became more and more evident that the purpose for which the large box was ordered by Mr. Watson was in order to remove the corpse of his murdered wife. It would seem, however, that second thoughts led to the abandonment of this plan, as far as sending her murdered corpse some distance by rail. Had the box been delivered and taken by the murderer upstairs, the accused, the Reverend Mr. Holmes, might easily have placed the body of his victim, doubled and crunched up as it was inside. But then came the difficulty of how the box was to be got down again. On the same day that he ordered the box, it is believed that he purchased a coil of new rope, for a quantity sufficient to cord the chest was found in the library after he was taken into custody. From the Stroud Journal, 28th of October 1871, the murder by a clergyman at Stockwell. On Wednesday, the Reverend John Selby Watson, who stands charged with having murdered his wife on Sunday the 8th inst., was brought up on remand for further examination before Mr. Ellison at Lambeth Police Court. The Honourable Mr. Theisger was again present on behalf of the prisoner, who maintained the same resigned, calm demeanour which has hitherto characterised him. John Mutter, a director of the South London School of Chemistry and Pharmacy in the Kennington Road, said he had analysed the contents of the bottles found on the drawers in the prisoner's bedroom where the murder was discovered. They both contained a colourless liquid, which he found to be the solution of hydroxanic acid, but not up to the standard of Shee's strength, which would contain 5% of the acid. The witness had also analysed the stains found on the prisoner's clothes, which he found to be stains of blood. On a pistol also which was stained, he had found some skin and about a dozen light and grey hairs in a sponge, which he analysed. Charles Turner, 219 Clapham Road, a trunk and brush manufacturer, said on Monday the 9th inst., at about 12:30, Mr. Watson went into his shop and asked to see some trunks. He saw several and said they were not strong enough. Mr. John Selby Watson said he wanted more of a packing case. The trunk manufacturer said he would make him one. The prisoner, Mr. Watson, said he wanted one 2'9" long by 2'5" wide and 1'9" deep. He said he was anxious to have it immediately and did not really decide then upon having it made. Mr. Watson returned to the shop again about 2 and said that he would have had it made I said, "It will be a very large case, sir. Have you any idea the size it will be?" And asked him what he wanted it for. He wanted to pack some papers in it. I said, "Would it not be possible for me, if I were to measure it, to put it into less space?" The prisoner was decided and said, "No, it must be the size I mentioned." The case was made, and about 2 o'clock the next day he called again and said, "Don't send the case round to my house, but I will pay you for it." He gave him a £10 note, and I gave him the change. The prisoner, having been cautioned in the usual way, was asked if he had anything to say. He respectfully muttered, "I have nothing to say." He was then committed for trial. The trial. The trial was delayed a number of times due to various illnesses of witnesses. Reverend Mr. Watson pled not guilty due to insanity. He avoided naming his wife as a provocation, but focused on temporary insanity. Many doctors were present in court, testifying to Watson's state of mind at the time of the murder. The jury found him guilty, but with a strong recommendation for leniency. The reasons were that Mr. Watson was a clergyman, he was aged, he had throughout life borne before the world a good character, and he received a great provocation from his wife. Reverend Mr. Watson had his sentence of death commuted to penal servitude for life by the Home Office. From the Cheltenham Examiner, 31st of January 1872. A respite has been forwarded to the Surrey County Prison for staying the execution of the Reverend John Selby Watson, with a view of commutation of the capital sentence passing on him to penal servitude for life. The Exeter Flying Press had strong views on this, stating that his defence insanity plea had been discredited and that a clergyman should be tried to a higher standard. He continued that his being a clergyman only increased the atrocity of the crime. The Reverend John Selby Watson was sent to Parkhurst Prison, where he died at the age of 80 on the 6th of July 1884 from falling out of his prison hammock.
Case 5. This case from 1874 looks at the murder of older Susan Ann Ingram and her 20 years younger husband, James Henry Gibbs. Gibbs, for some strange reason, does not wish to reveal to the world his marriage to Susan. As the community become involved in bringing to light the marriage deception, Susan's missing body, horribly decomposed, is found in a ditch on the estate on which Gibbs works.
The St. Mellons tragedy. The crime. 42-year-old Susan Ann Ingram, also known as Mrs. Gibbs, is found under some hedges, dead. The body is badly decomposed. It is believed she was hit on the head and then had her throat slit and was dragged to a ditch which normally would be filled with water. Scandal. Before the crime is committed, scandal is afoot and is the talk of the town. James Henry Gibbs, 22, the butler at Clanrumney Hall estate, is wooing pretty Miss Mary Jones, a local lass. They have been in an understanding for some 2 years, and indeed it is expected that they will marry soon. Being the butler at Clanrumney Hall is an elevated position and puts Gibbs in a superior position to his fellow servants of the hall. But Gibbs is not friendly with his colleagues. His position entails little in the way of actual work, unlike the position of his fellow colleagues, as the lord of the hall spends the majority of his time away. But wait. A woman appears on the scene, 42 years of age, who claims to be his wife. Is she or isn't she? Attempts are made by Gibbs to keep the marriage secret, but his colleagues have found out about the marriage and begun to work hard to bring his full deception to light. When Gibbs is confronted about the marriage to Susan, he loudly claims his innocence and continues to portray himself as a single man. James Henry Gibbs. Gibbs, by all accounts, grew up in a loving home with supportive parents who did their best to help pave the way for their son's success. Gibbs, with considerable charm, worked his way up from errand boy to a footman position at Hampton. Here, 19-year-old Gibbs met kindly, well-liked Susan Ingram, 39, who worked there as a cook and a housekeeper. There seems to be little doubt that a relationship formed between young, charming James Gibbs and considerably older Susan Ingram. Indeed, that relationship became so intimate of a nature that there was talk at the time of the two marrying. An altercation occurred between them where Susan accused Gibbs of being unsteady in their attachment. The relationship was broken off and Gibbs left the employment, eventually landing the plum job of butler at Clanrumney Hall near Cardiff. The owner, Mr. Williams, was a single gentleman and spent a large portion of his time away from his estate shooting. The job gave Gibbs plenty of time to follow additional activities of his choosing. One of the pastimes he followed is the wooing of a young, pretty local lass, Miss Mary Jones. Susan Ingram, or Mrs. Susan Gibbs. Throughout the whole of the life of Mrs. Gibbs, she is spoken of by all to whom she was known as a kind-hearted woman, and her amiable qualities and her faithfulness are referred to in her testimonials of character. She had but one failing, her intense fondness for the man who murdered her, and this intensity of feeling made her blind to his faults. And when the separation took place between them before marriage, it overcame the reserve of so natural to women, and she took the fatal step of seeking to revive the intimacy by first writing to him, begging him to renew it. Upon the departure of Gibbs, Susan began to have regrets. She sent pestering letters to Gibbs's father, attempting to find out where Gibbs was working. Gibbs's father, concerned about the vast age difference between the two, would not give her his son's new work address. However, eventually Susan managed to glean that Gibbs was now working at Clanrumney Hall and began to correspond with Gibbs in earnest. The contents of the letter are known. Her passion for him almost amounted to insanity. She could not do anything, was suffering great mental torture, and in the letters she wrote to him, she begged of him to forget the cause of their separation. He at first declined and wrote back that he was going to America or Australia. She wrote several times again, and a communication was opened. Soon afterwards, letters were frequently passing between them. Prior to this, Gibbs had formed the acquaintance of Miss Mary Jones of Pentwenney, St. Mellons. He first met her at a concert given at the National School there, and he was afterwards an almost constant visitor at her house, and was acknowledged by the parents as her future husband. Gibbs begins to match Susan's passion for him in his correspondence with her. However, while he continued his pursuance of Miss Jones, he was constantly writing to Miss Ingram, and he began a kind of double life. From the Cardiff Times, the 29th of August 1874, the St. Mellons tragedy, the marriage. Miss Ingram had a little money in the post office savings bank, and Gibbs knew it. She was desirous of leaving service and commencing in some business. So was he. The whole arrangements for the marriage were carried on by letter, for he never went to see her at Weybridge until he took her to Jersey. Miss Ingram wished to be married in England, but Gibbs refused, and she gave way, but not until she had exhausted all her powers of persuasion. It was of no use. He had resolved that they should be married in Jersey, and she drew from the bank £30 to pay his fare to London and their expenses to and from Jersey. Gibbs, on the 24th of July, 1873, called for her, and they at once proceeded to Southampton and thence to Jersey. On the 30th of July, Gibbs and Miss Ingram were married at St. Saviour's Church in Jersey, and on the 5th of August, after a residence of 12 days on the island, they left for England. They arrived at Southampton the same day, proceeded to London, stayed there that night, and then left for Cardiff the next morning. He alleged as a reason for this that he had only obtained leave of his master for a fortnight, and his time was up that day. Gibbs plants Susan, now the new Mrs. Gibbs, in a hostel in Cardiff, where she waits and waits and waits. Gibbs does not return for her. Susan's money is beginning to dwindle. She leaves the hostel and finds work close to Clanlumney Hall, where she knows Gibbs works. Gibbs had, before his departure of her, in the strongest of terms, warned Susan to not inform anyone of their marriage, stating that he could lose his position as butler if they knew he was married. Susan abides by this request reluctantly, only telling her very closest friends in the lodging house where now she lives. From the Cardiff Times, the 29th of August, 1874, the St. Mellons tragedy. At first, Gibbs called to see her once or twice a week, but he seldom came without drawing money from her. She worked very hard, lived sparingly, and never, unless in the most urgent necessity, did she draw upon her small fund at the bank. Eventually, with one person knowing another person, it became known that Gibbs was married to Susan Ingram. Gibbs, then approached by this information, always angrily denies it. However, Gibbs has always had a local reputation in the community as a liar. He is not believed. Susan is beginning to tire of the charade that they are not married, and argues that now that many people know of the marriage in the community, and he still has his position at the Hall, they should announce their marriage and live openly as man and wife. Gibbs, in return, suggests numerous walks at night on isolated paths. After one walk, dependable, kindly Susan does not return back to her lodging house. Her friends are greatly concerned. Gibbs is the obvious primary suspect. From the South Wales Daily News, the 17th of June, 1874. The horrible murder near Cardiff. Conclusion of the inquest on the body, and the verdict of wilful murder against the accused, James Henry Gibbs. The excitement, which has been increasing for some days in the village, grew considerably yesterday, when it was generally announced that the police would complete their case, and the jury arrived at a decision as to the cause of the death of the deceased Susan Ann Gibbs. Work seems to be almost entirely suspended, and from the early part of the morning groups of the residents of the village clustered around the Blue Bell, and others stood outside the doors of their houses, watching the approach of the police and the various parties concerned in the inquiry. The only topic of conversation was that which had engaged the sole attention of the residents of the district for more than a week, that the accused, Gibbs, was guilty of murder. All persons seemed to be thoroughly convinced, and many of them knew more of the history of the case than has appeared in the evidence given before the coroner. This evidence only serves to give a meagre outline of a case which the police are now actively engaged in completing, and which, perhaps, will not be completed until the prisoner is put on his trial. From the very first, it appeared that the deceased was rendered insensible by a blow from some instrument whilst in the field by the side of the ditch, that the body was then dragged into the ditch and the throat cut there. The police have as yet failed to find, and now probably never will, the instrument with which the deed was committed. The time that has elapsed before the body was discovered gave the murderer, whoever he was, ample time to put away any instrument he might have used for the purpose. The razor found by Sergeant Hale in the cigar box in the prisoner's pantry has marks upon it, but it would now be almost impossible to say if there were marks of blood, and more especially human blood. The rings which were taken off the finger of the deceased, the stocking, the boot, and the bag with its contents which she carried with her have not been found, and the police are still engaged in their endeavours to find them. They had sufficient evidence to prove that the deceased met with a violent death, and also to show that the prisoner was the last seen with her alive. The witness. William Morgan, gamekeeper at Clanrumney Hall, said on the night of the 9th of May, James Gibbs and his supposed wife were standing together near the cover by the fish pond. She was talking very loudly and appeared to be scolding him. She had an umbrella which she waved backwards and forwards in a very excited manner. They remained there 5 or 10 minutes, and all the time Mrs. Gibbs seemed to be scolding. Gibbs stood with his hands in his pockets but did not say anything. The gate they were standing against was on the same ditch as where the body was found, but about 100 yards below. I did not know that he was married, but I was told that he was, and it was also said that he was courting Miss Jones of Mellons. I have seen them together at the concert given at St. Mellons on the 6th of May. I saw Gibbs and Miss Jones sitting side by side. I heard they were going to get married. It was common talk about the village. Miss Mary Jones was then called. She is a young woman of rather light complexion, light hair, and small stature. She appeared a quiet, respectable young woman, and gave her evidence in a straightforward manner and with little hesitation, although the police, it seemed, were in possession of information to contradict many of the statements she made. She said, "I lived at St. Affluons with my father and mother and am a single woman. I know the prisoner, James Henry Gibbs. I have known him for the last 2 years at least. It was 2 years last January. He has been paying his addresses to me and asking me to marry him. We were about to get married next Saturday. He represented himself as a single man. I heard about 6 weeks ago that he was married. I told him of what I had heard, and he denied it. He continued to pay his addresses to me, and I believed that he was a single man." Samuel Shepherd said, "I am Inspector of the Monmouth County Constabulary stationed at Newport. In consequence of the communications of P.C. Hughes last Wednesday, the 3rd of June, in Newport, I proceeded to Clanrumney Farm, where I saw the dead body of a female lying in the ditch. It was some considerable way in under the brambles, which formed an arch overhead. I got into the ditch and examined the body, and found it to be in a very advanced state of decomposition, the head and face perfectly black. It was lying on its back with the head downwards. I noticed from the chin down to the stomach was a mass of corruption, all alive and moving with maggots. The mouth was open. I saw no tongue, which appeared to be gone. I noticed the left hand was placed across the stomach, and what I took to be a cut between the ring finger and the middle finger. There was some discoloration there. The right hand was down by her side. She had a light brown skirt that had given way at the waist, a velvet jacket, and a waterproof cloak, which was drawn backwards and upwards beyond the head, as if the body had been dragged up the ditch. I also noticed that the hair was dragged backwards, and what appeared to me to be her chignon was lying under the left side of her head. I sent for Mrs. Mahoney, No. 4 Dispensary Court, Cardiff, and allowed the body to remain there until her arrival. She saw the body in my presence and said it was the body of Susan Gibbs, a lodger at her house, and the wife of the butler at Clanrumney Hall. I had some boards put together and removed the body to a shed on the farm, where it was seen by Dr. Lowhor. I then proceeded to Clanrumney Hall. I rang at the front door. The prisoner came to the door to answer it. I asked him if his name was Gibbs. He said it was. I told him I wanted to speak to him and walked with him into the kitchen. I then and there told him that a woman had been found dead in a ditch that morning on the Clanrumney estate. The body of the woman had been identified as that of his wife. He said, "My wife?" I said, "Yes, your wife, Susan Gibbs, who has been lodging at No. 4 Dispensary Court, and who has been missing from her lodgings since 3 weeks last Tuesday. I am going to apprehend you, and you must consider yourself in custody on the charge of her wilful murder. You need not say anything in answer to the charge, and if you do, I shall be obliged to take it down in writing and may give it in evidence against you." I afterwards told him that it was necessary that I search his boxes and drawers. I went upstairs with him and searched his boxes and found nothing. On his person I found a bunch of keys which he said belonged to his father, and that he kept them as a memorial of him. That same evening I took the prisoner to Newport in a cab. On Thursday the 14th I got him remanded and visited the Clanrumney estate again, in company with Mr. Mackintosh and Sergeant Hale, between 4 and 5 p.m. Myself and Sergeant Hale visited Clanrumney Hall, and in the butler's pantry on the top of the cupboard I found this umbrella, which had been identified by Mrs. Wilson, which she states the deceased had in her possession when she left Cardiff, and also a parcel of clothes containing a pair of stockings, a pair of female's drawers, a slip, a chemise marked S. Ingram. I took these articles and the umbrella to Mrs. Mahoney, and she identified the articles of clothing as having belonged to Susan Gibbs. The umbrella was identified by Mrs. Wilson. On Friday the 5th, I visited the police station in Cardiff, where 3 boxes had been deposited belonging to Mrs. Gibbs. I opened the boxes with 3 of the keys of the bunch found on the body of Mrs. Gibbs. We searched the boxes and took possession of various letters, photographs, etc., and then returned to Clanrumney Hall and made a thorough search of the butler's pantry and other places to which he had access. On the Monday, I had locked up 3 razors found in the pantry. I now took possession of them, but I did notice a stain on them. Also, an album found in the prisoner's drawers. I also saw Sergeant Hall take a razor from a cigar box in a cupboard. There were indications in the grate of a large quantity of paper having been burnt. Our great object in searching the boxes was to find the marriage certificate and the post office bank book, which it was said that the deceased had, but neither could be found. The body. The body was in such a state of decomposition that it could not be expected that the medical men could state anything more than judging from the saturated clothes the blood issued from the neck. The jury consulted for about an hour and then returned a verdict of wilful murder against James Henry Gibbs, who was committed for trial in the usual manner at the next assizes. The trial. The evidence, although circumstantial in nature, was overwhelming. Gibbs throughout protested his innocence. However, the time that the prosecution had before the trial was well spent looking into his antecedents. What came out was a picture of a man with a history of lying and deception wherever he went. Yes, he had an easy charm, but he was also known to lie about anything. Given the evidence of Susan's objects in his possession, the known relationship between Gibbs and Susan and Miss Mary Jones, and the numerous letters that Susan had kept and treasured, which outlined his new invitations for dark, late-night walks, the jury had little difficulty finding Gibbs guilty. Gibbs, protesting his innocence throughout, did not go quietly to his death. The execution. From the South Wales Daily News, the 24th of August, 1874. The execution. Terrible scene at the gallows. The cowardice of Gibbs. Gibbs dies protesting his innocence. The execution took place at 8 a.m. Gibbs kept up well till the last night, but when he was brought from the condemned cell to the pinioning room, his cries were terrible. He had to be led to the scaffold by 2 of the warders, who held him there while the rope was being put around his neck. He died protesting his innocence and calling on God to witness his innocence. He died almost without a struggle.
Case 6. This gruesome murder captured the attention of the public and the government at the time. Lipski, real name Lobulki, a slightly built 22-year-old Polish immigrant who worked as a stick maker, is found under the bed of a horribly murdered 22-year-old pregnant woman, Miriam Angel. Historically, the name Lipski was heard to be called out by a gentleman seen with Elizabeth Stride, a victim of Jack the Ripper. Israel Lipski had been executed roughly a year before, so the reference was not specific to him. About the victim. Isaac Angel and his wife had been married in Poland. They had been in England 10 months and had been living at 16 Batty Street for 6 weeks. Isaac confirmed that he had never spoken to the prisoner Israel Lipski, nor had he seen his wife do so. Miriam Angel was 22. Some news reports stated that she was expecting and that she was approaching her confinement. About Israel Lipski. Israel Lipski, as he was known as, was described as a Polish Jew who had been born in Warsaw in 1865. Lipski had arrived in London approximately 2 years before. Lipski was not his original name.
His proper name was Lobulki. Upon arrival in England, his name was considered difficult to pronounce, so authorities offered him to go by the name Lipski, which he accepted. Lipski was repeatedly described by those who knew him as a quiet, hard-working young man. He was approximately 22 years of age and of slight build. His profession was that of a walking stick maker, and one of the tools required to make walking sticks was aqua fortis, a highly corrosive substance which was used for staining the wood for walking sticks. Lipski had a girlfriend, Kate Lyons. Reportedly, he and Kate had known one another for some 18 months, and they had just been engaged for 6 months. The banns, the formal wedding announcements, were due to come out at the same time as the murder took place. Lipski's financial difficulties. Lipski had recently had setbacks with work. Lipski's place of employment was not sufficient for him to earn a wage. His sweetheart's mother, Mrs. Lyons, had suggested he go into business for himself. Israel took the remainder of his money in the bank, invested it in tools to try to work for himself. The day of Miriam Angel's murder, Lipski had been self-employed for only 2 days. The scene of the crime. On the 26th of June, in a lodging house on Batty Street, Whitechapel, fellow tenants remarked as to how they had not seen young Miriam Angel, 22. It was approximately 11 a.m., and the expectant young woman would normally have been up by now. Neighbours went to the door and called out, but there was no response. The door was tried, but it was locked from the inside. The decision was to break the lock and enter, where they were met with the appalling sight of Miriam lying on the disarrayed bed, with her sleeping attire pushed up above her waist and acid burns around her mouth, hands, and breasts. The event became even more extraordinary with the appearance of a man under the bed of the murdered woman. The man also seemed to have been poisoned with a similar substance as to that which had been given to Miriam. From the Illustrated Police News, 16th of July, 1887, the Whitechapel poisoning case. At 16 Batty Street reside several Poles of the poorest description. Among these was a man named Isaac Angel, a boot riveter, who, with his wife Rachel, occupied the 2 rooms on the first floor. On the top floor were 2 rooms, one of which was rented by a single young man named Israel Lipski, aged 22 years, a walking stick maker. Lipski was known by the other inmates to be a hard-working and respectable young man, and when he retired to his room on Monday night, nothing unusual was noticed in his appearance or manner. About 6:30 on Tuesday morning, Mr. Angel got up and left home, as usual, to go to his employment, leaving his wife in bed, apparently fast asleep. Mrs. Angel, who was 22 years of age, was near her confinement. About 11:30, Mrs. Lee Levy, another lodger, not seeing or hearing anything of Mrs. Angel, became alarmed and went up to the bedroom and burst open the door. Mrs. Angel was lying on the bed, apparently dead. She was terribly burned, evidently with some acid about the head, face, neck, and breast. An alarm was at once raised, and Dr. J. Key of 100 Commercial Road was sent for. He found that Mrs. Angel was dead, the cause of death being, in his opinion, from a cursory outward examination, poisoning by nitric acid. Dr. K then saw a man lying under the bed on his back, apparently in a dying condition. This proved to be Lipsky, whose clothing was much burnt by the same acid. Dr. K, being of opinion that Lipsky would be better treated at the London hospital, ordered his removal there. Lipsky was sent to London hospital and visited by police later in the evening. Police reported that Lipsky seemed okay. The next day, Lipsky made an astonishing statement as to the events of the crime scene and how he happened to be there. The two ruffians referred to in his statement were two known associates of his, Schmusch and Rosenblum. From the Illustrated Police News, 16th of July, 1887. I told the landlady to make some coffee, and I sent the two men for some brandy. I afterwards went upstairs. I there saw both of these men and saw them open a box. They took hold of me by my throat, threw me down, opened my mouth, and poured some poison into it. They said, "That is the brandy." They got my hands behind me and asked me if I had any more money, and I said, "I have got no more than the sovereign which I gave you to get the brandy." Then they asked, "Where is your gold chain?" I said, "It is in pawn." They said, "If you don't give it, you will be as dead as the woman." They put a piece of wood in my mouth. I struggled, and they then put their knees on me against my throat. Lipsky goes on to state that they threw him under the bed where he pretended to be dead. Lipsky does not explain why the door was locked from the inside. July 2nd, 1887. On Saturday, at the Thames Police Court, Israel Lipsky, 22, described as a walking stick maker of 16 Batty Street, Commercial Road, was charged on remand with the wilful murder of Miriam Angel on Tuesday, the 28th day of June last. Now, there was no question that Miriam had died at the hands of another, and with Lipsky found under the bed of the recently murdered woman in a room with the door locked from inside, he became the primary suspect. Investigations were pursued, and a clear picture began to develop. Checks were made, and it was found that Lipsky had purchased the aquafortis the very day that the murder occurred. His argument was that it had been purchased for work. The case against Lipsky was described in detail in the papers. The trial. From the Illustrated Police News, the 6th of August, 1887. Whitechapel murder trial of Lipsky. Opening the case. The deceased was a married woman who resided with her husband at 16 Batty Street, Whitechapel, and the prisoner, Israel Lipsky, occupied a garret in the same house. The husband of deceased Miriam Angel was in the habit of going to work every morning at about 6, and then prisoner no doubt was aware of this fact. On the morning of the murder, the husband of the deceased went out as usual, leaving his wife in bed and apparently asleep. Nothing more seems to have occurred until 11, when, in consequence of something that took place, some of the other lodgers went to the room occupied by the deceased and found the door locked from the inside. The door was forced open, and the deceased, Miriam Angel, was found lying on the bed, quite dead. A further examination of the room led to the prisoner Israel Lipsky being discovered under the bed in an unconscious state. The result of the medical examination was that it appeared that the death of the deceased was the result of the administration of nitric acid, and the condition of the prisoner Israel Lipsky seemed to be ascribed to the same cause. For our listeners, nitric acid is an ingredient of aqua fortis. The actual circumstances under which the poison was administered were, of course, enveloped in mystery. But the suggestion on the part of the prosecution was that after the husband had left, the prisoner, Israel Lipsky, had entered the bedroom of the deceased Miriam Angel with the intention to commit a criminal assault upon the woman, and that failing in this object, he had forced the poison down the woman's throat and then attempted to destroy himself through the same means, but did not succeed in consequence of not sufficient poison being left in the bottle. When the prisoner, Israel Lipsky, was apprehended, he appeared to have made some extraordinary statements with regard to the manner in which he became possessed of nitric acid, and upon these facts the charge of wilful murder was preferred against the prisoner, Israel Lipsky. On the same day, the prisoner, Israel Lipsky, went to the London hospital, but by the evening he was quite sensible. An interpreter was present, but the prisoner, Israel Lipsky, made a statement quite voluntarily. On the 2nd of July, Israel Lipsky was formally charged with Miriam Angel's murder at the London hospital. He made no reply. Evidence statements. Witness evidence. Madame Lipsky, no relation to Israel Lipsky, and the wife of the landlord of 16 Batty Street, the lodging house, said that to her knowledge the prisoner was not acquainted with the deceased woman. Madame Lipsky said that she, remembering the morning of the 28th of June, and she saw the prisoner in the kitchen on that morning. He asked her to make some coffee for him, and she did so. The prisoner wanted to borrow £5 of her. Madame Lipsky told him she had not got it, and told him to get it from the mother of the girl he was going to be married to. At about 11, in consequence of something she heard, she went to a little window and looked into Mrs. Angel's bedroom and saw her lying on the bed. The bedroom door was then burst open and the deceased was discovered to be dead. She was lying on her side and part of her person was exposed. The evidence of Mr. W. Piper. Assistant to Mr. Key, a surgeon in the Commercial Road, deposed that he went to the house about 11:30 on the 20th of June and saw the deceased, Miriam Angel, lying on her back in bed. He described the position of her clothes and said that her chemise and nightclothes were rolled up above her waist. He continued that he saw a glass was on the table which appeared to have contained beer or stout. He noticed some yellow marks on the clothing and on the face of the deceased, which appeared to have been caused by burning. He was subsequently shown a bottle containing a small quantity of liquid, which appeared to be aqua fortis. A police constable stated that after the prisoner, Israel Lipsky, had been taken from under the bed, he looked at the deceased for an instant and then fell down insensible. The evidence from Dr. J. W. Key. Dr. Key said he saw the deceased Miriam Angel at about 12 on the same day of the murder. She was lying on her back and a stream of yellowish water was pouring from her mouth. There were several stains on her caused by aqua fortis. He noticed that there were splashes of blood on the feather bed, but there were no marks of violence on the body, and, in his opinion, the deceased had been dead for about 3 hours. Evidence from the post-mortem. It was found that the back of Miriam's throat was charred and that a considerable quantity of nitric acid had gone down through the larynx and the trachea and into the stomach. This was an important finding as it indicated that the nitric acid had been poured down her throat while Miriam was in a state of insensibility. From the post-mortem, 4 blows to the head were evident. The coroner believed that the blows to the head would have been sufficient to make Miriam insensible, therefore allowing the poison to be poured down her throat. It was estimated that half an ounce of aqua fortis had been given to her, and that the immediate cause of death was suffocation by the acid going down the windpipe and closing the air passage. With Lipski, medical evidence suggested that Lipski had taken so little it would hardly have made him unconscious. No witnesses were called for the defence. The trial was mired in accusations of prejudice based on Lipski's immigrant status, as well as accusations of anti-Semitism. These accusations were ignored and the trial continued. The prosecution summation. At the time the deceased lost her life, she and the prisoner, Israel Lipski, were the only persons in the room. And, on the very day on which the occurrence took place, the prisoner had purchased the acid which was undoubtedly the cause of death. As for motive, it was reasonable to suppose that the prisoner Israel Lipski might have intended to commit an outrage upon this young woman or to commit a robbery. The defence summation. It had been proven that the prisoner was a respectable, well-conducted young man, and there did not appear to be the slightest motive for him to commit such a horrible crime. The jury were asked to come to the conclusion that the evidence was not conclusive, and on this ground he asked for an acquittal of his client. Mr. Justice Stevens summing up. Mr. Justice Stevens said there was no difficulty of a legal kind that existed in the matter, and the only question for the jury was whether the evidence established the guilt of the prisoner. The act was clearly wilful murder by whomever committed, and the only thing the jury had to consider was whether the prisoner was the person who had committed the murder. Mr. Justice Stevens continued, if the crime had been prompted by lust and there had been resistance on the part of the woman, a feeling of fury might have ensued, and this might have led to the commission of the crime. The verdict. The jury retired at 5:15 to consider their verdict. They returned in a very few minutes and found the prisoner guilty. When the prisoner was called upon to state whether he had anything to say and why judgment should not be passed upon him, he replied, I am innocent. I did not do it. Mr. Justice Stephen, having put on the black cap, addressed the prisoner and said he had been convicted of the crime of wilful murder, and by the law of England the punishment for that crime was death. Lipski maintained that he was innocent, and accusations of anti-Semitism were brought up regarding the case. With pressure building, the government gave Lipski a respite while the case was being reviewed. From the Illustrated Police News, 20th of August 1887. The respite of Lipski. We are informed that the convict Israel Lipski has been respited until Monday the 22nd inst, and a letter in the following terms has been written to the governor of Newgate Prison. Strenuous efforts were made on Saturday afternoon in order to obtain from the Home Secretary a reprieve of the condemned man, Lipski. Mrs. Lipski, the landlady at 16 Batty Street, who is not related to Israel Lipski, stated that she is still firmly of the opinion that the young man is innocent. No person could have conducted himself better during the time that he lodged with her. On Monday afternoon, Kate Lyons, the accused's sweetheart, who resides at 3 Watney Passage, Watney Street, Whitechapel, made a statement in which she said her belief is that the accused is innocent. She had known him for 18 months and had been engaged to him for 6 months. The bans were to have been published at about the time that Lipsky was taken into custody. Miss Lyons said that, accompanied by her mother, she visited Lipsky in the condemned cell, where she had an interview of nearly an hour. Israel averred his innocence and said he was going to suffer for what he had not done. The case was reviewed and no grounds for respite could be found. From the Illustrated Police News, 27th of August 1887. The execution of Lipsky. A conference lasting several hours was held at the Home Office on Saturday afternoon, at which, among others, Mr. Justice Stevens and Mr. Matthews were present. All the circumstances connected with the case of Lipsky were exhaustively discussed, with the result that at a late hour on Saturday the following letter was forwarded by the special messenger to Mr. Haywood, the condemned man's solicitor. Whitehall, August 20th, 1887. Sir, with reference to the case of Israel Lipsky, I am directed to acquaint you that after full consideration of the circumstances and of all the representations made by yourself and others on behalf of the prisoner, the Secretary of State sees no reason for advising any interference with the due course of the law. I am, sir, your obedient servant, signed Godfrey Lushington. With Lipsky now facing the death penalty with no chance of respite, he confessed as is recounted in the papers. The confession. On Sunday, the prisoner made a full confession to the Reverend S. Singer of the circumstances connected with his crime. It is in the following terms. The statement was at once forwarded to the Home Secretary. I, Israel Lipsky, before I appear before God in judgment, desire to speak the whole truth concerning the crime of which I am accused. I will not die with a lie on my lips. I will not let others suffer, even in suspicion, for my sin. I alone was guilty of the murder of Miriam Angel. I thought the woman had money in her room, so I entered the door, being unlocked, and the woman was asleep. I had no thought of violating her, and I swear I never approached her with that object, nor did I wrong her in this way. Miriam Angel awoke before I could search about her for money and cried out, but very softly thereupon I struck her on the head and seized her by the neck and closed her mouth with my hand so that she should not arouse the attentions of those who were about the house. I had long been utterly tired of my life and had bought a penny's worth of aquafortis that morning for the purpose of putting an end to myself. Suddenly I thought of the bottle I had in my pocket. I drew it out and poured some of the contents down her throat. She fainted, and, recognizing my desperate condition, I took the rest. The bottle was an old one which I had formerly used, and was the same as that which I had taken with me to the oil shop. The quantity of aquafortis I took had no effect on me. Hearing the voices of people coming upstairs, I crawled under the bed. The woman seemed already dead. There was only a very short time from the moment of my entering the room until I was taken away. In the agitation I also fainted. I do not know how it was that my arms became abraded. I did not feel it and was not aware of it. As to the door being locked from the inside, I myself did this immediately after I entered the room, wishing not to be interrupted. I solemnly declare that Rosenblum and Schmush know nothing whatever of the crime of all which I have been guilty, and I alone. I implore them to pardon me for having in my despair tried to cast the blame upon them. I also seek the forgiveness of the bereaved husband. I admit that I have had a fair trial and acknowledge the justice of the sentence that has been passed upon me. The confession makes no mention of the lurid state of undress that Miriam was found in. The execution. The young Israel Lipsky, aged 22 and by trade a stickmaker, was executed on Monday morning inside the prison of Newgate for the murder of Miriam Angel, of which he was convicted at the last sitting of the Central Criminal Court. At 7 o'clock on Monday morning, a large crowd had collected outside Newgate, and by the time that the execution took place at 8 o'clock, there were 5,000 or 6,000 people present. A large percentage of these were foreign, while a considerable number of well-dressed women mingled in the crowd. The windows of the houses in the neighbourhood were lined with spectators, and those who have witnessed Old Bailey executions for many a year have never since the abolition of public executions has the neighbourhood of Newgate presented such an appearance. So dense indeed was the crowd that it practically resulted in a stoppage of the traffic for the time in the thoroughfares converging on the prison. From then until the final scene at the scaffold, the reverend gentleman did not leave the side of the condemned man, who conducted himself with wonderful composure and seemed thoroughly penitent. As the prisoner had only an imperfect knowledge of the English language, the sheriffs had obtained the assistance of Mr. Albert, the official interpreter, and through him the prisoner was asked whether he wished to make any further statement or to add anything to the confession he had already made. The prisoner replied, "No, I have nothing more to add to what I have already said. It is all true, and I am guilty." He then expressed his thanks to the sheriffs, the governor, and the other officials for their kindness to him whilst in prison, and made use of the remarkable expression in broken English, "I have never been so well treated in my life as I have been since I have been in prison." The prisoner was a slightly made young man, only weighing about 9 stone, and Berry, the executioner, gave him a drop of 6 feet. He appeared to die without a struggle, and subsequent examination by Dr. Gilbert, the medical officer of the prison, showed that the neck was dislocated, and death must have been instantaneous. At the moment of the execution, the black flag was run up, and its appearance was received with 3 cheers by a large crowd outside. After hanging an hour, the body was cut down, and after the inquest, it was buried within the prison.
Further particulars. We end today's crime compilation with a further particular segment that is remotely connected to the Lipsky case and the Jack the Ripper saga. Spiritualism was rampant in later Victorian England. One very popular entertainer of the time was Stuart Cumberland, a self-proclaimed thought reader. His shows, usually sold out, were seen across theatres of their day. His act included alleged impossible feats such as the ability to identify at random any object hidden in a room. Another thrilling part of his performance was to ask an audience member to imagine a murder scene where he would attempt to read the thoughts of the audience participant and reenact the imagined crime. Cumberland stressed that he had no genuine psychic ability, but rather that he could detect the tiniest movements of his subject's hands which would relay their thoughts. We take a look at this Victorian version, combining the Victorian public's fascination with crime and its equal interest in spiritualism. From the Dundee Courier, the 22nd of October, 1888. Thought Reader and the Detection of Crime. Interesting experiments in Dundee. On Saturday evening, a series of experiments to illustrate the possibility of detecting crime by thought reading was conducted in the dining room of the Queen's Hotel by the Chevalier Stuart Cumberland, FRGS. Great interest taken in this matter at present, owing undoubtedly to the failure of the police to discover the perpetrator or perpetrators of the Whitechapel murders, and it was largely attested and by a large audience, which was also representative of the various classes in the community. Those present included merchants, manufacturers, clergymen, lawyers, medical men, educationalists, police officials, etc. Mr. T.S. Ross compiled with the request to take the chair. Murderers are not professional killers. Previous to commencing the experiments, Mr. Cumberland made a short statement explaining that murderers were not professional killers of men and women, but that, as a rule, they were highly emotional beings, but committing their crime through jealousy, hatred, or some other uncontrollable feeling, and that, therefore, it was not possible to give physical interpretation of their thoughts. He also gave instances of cases where he had successfully read the thoughts of actual criminals. Mr. Lawson, the murderer. Having produced an ugly-looking dagger by means of which a real murder had, he said, been committed, Mr. Cumberland invited one of the gentlemen present to personate a murderer. Mr. John Lawson, who responded, was requested to imagine that he was in love with a young lady, but that he had a successful rival, also present, for her hand, and that he had conceived and carried on a plan to murder him. Mr. Cumberland, who was then blindfolded, took the hand of Mr. Lawson, containing the dagger, and, in a few seconds, selected a young gentleman at the back of those in the room as the successful rival, and after some difficulty indicating the spot in the neck of the victim where the dagger had supposedly entered. Mr. Lawson admitted that he had intended to cut the throat of his rival, but that the wrong man had been picked out. Mr. Cumberland, however, speedily found the real victim, the Reverend C.M. Grant, and explained that his dubiety had arisen through Mr. Lawson not having continuously concentrated his thoughts upon the person operated on. A much better subject. Mr. Henry McGrady proved a much better subject. Mr. Cumberland at once selected Mr. Dewar, the chief constable, as the murdered individual. In his case, the only discrepancy being that instead of a fatal stab in the abdomen, as indicated, Mr. McGrady explained that he intended to rip up his victim, an explanation which elicited great laughter. Reverend James Drummond, Mr. Wim Lawson of Balliothic, and Mr. Walter Shepherd then thought of various objects in the room, and these, although one of them was the polished cranium of one of the gentlemen present, were in succession readily pointed out by Mr. Cumberland. In Mr. Drummond's case, however, one failure occurred before the success was recorded. An interesting dramatic tableau was then witnessed. The murder of Professor Ewing. Mr. Cumberland having gone out, along with the Reverend Mr. McCrae and the chairman, Mr. Lawson, they seized upon Professor Ewing of University College, dragged him to the middle of the room, where he was thrown down upon the floor and murdered, with 2 daggers thrust by Mr. Shepherd, after which Mr. Lawson rifled the pockets of their victim and hid the stolen valuables. When the incident had been completed, Mr. Cumberland returned, and, having taken the hand of Mr. Lawson, which he placed across his forehead, he proceeded straight to the seat of the professor, and was accurate with all the details, the murder and robbery which those present had previously witnessed, finding also the hidden abstracted property. Mr. Cumberland then said that it might occur that when the real murderer had been apprehended, some necessary link in the chain of evidence, such as the knife or dagger with which the deed had been committed, might be missing, and that the murderer himself might unconsciously be made to declare the place of its concealment. Hiding the dagger. He then requested Mr. McCrae and Mr. Dewar to hide the dagger in any part of the hotel. This having been done, Mr. Cumberland, holding the hand of Mr. Dewar, proceeded up the staircase to the top of the building, where Mr. Dewar and Mr. McCrae had actually formerly been, but finding some difficulty with the former, who apparently could not realize himself in the position of a criminal, he took the hand of the latter, and then at once, returning downstairs, proceeded straight to the coffee room annex, where he discovered the hidden dagger lying behind some books on a shelf of a cabinet. A thoroughly successful evening. This concluded the experiment, and, keeping in view that the fact that the names of the gentlemen selected as subjects precludes the slightest idea of any collusion between them and the principal performer, it must be admitted that they were, so far at least as they went, thoroughly successful. At the close, a hearty vote of thanks was, on the motion of the chairman, awarded to Mr. Stuart Cumberland for his interesting séance, which was a foretaste of the extraordinary experiments which are to be formed tonight and tomorrow night in the Kinnaird Hall. That concludes this month's crime compilation of Deadly Love. We really hope that you enjoyed the show. If you did enjoy the show, we would be really grateful if you could like or subscribe and share our video. It all helps. We're a small independent team of 3, passionate about historical crime, and we love to share with other enthusiasts. Thank you so much for your kind support. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles.